Chapter 12 of Rose in Bloom by Louisa May Alcott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 12 At Kitty's Ball. Rose had no new gown to wear on this festive occasion, and gave one little sigh of regret as she put on the pale blue silk, refreshed with clouds of gaze de Chambéry. But a smile followed, very bright and sweet, as she added the cluster of forget-me-not, which Charlie had conjured up through the agency of an old German florist, for one part of her plan had been carried out, and Prince was invited to be her escort, much to his delight, though he wisely made no protestations of any sort, and showed his gratitude by being a model gentleman. This pleased Rose, for the late humiliation, and a very sincere desire to atone for it, gave him an air of pensive dignity which was very effective. Aunt Clara could not go, for a certain new cosmetic, privately used to improve the once fine complexion, which had been her pride till late hours impaired it, had brought out an unsightly eruption, reducing her to the depths of woe, and leaving her no solace for her disappointment but the sight of the elegant velvet dress spread forth upon her bed in melancholy state. So Aunt Jessie was chaperone, to Rose's great satisfaction, and looked as pretty as a pink, Archie thought, in her matronly pearl-colored gown, with a dainty trifle of rich lace on her still abundant hair. He was very proud of his little mamma, and as devoted as a lover. "To keep his hand in against Phoebe's return," she said laughingly, when he brought her a nosegay of blush roses to light up her quiet costume. A happier mother did not live than Mrs. Jessie, as she sat contentedly beside Sister Jane, who graced the frivolous scene in a serious black gown with a diadem of purple asters nodding above her severe brow, both watching their boys with a maternal conviction that no other parent could show such remarkable specimens as these. Each had done her best according to her light, and years of faithful care were now beginning to bear fruit and the promise of goodly men, so dear to the hearts of true mothers. Mrs. Jessie watched her three tall sons with something like wonder, for Archie was a fine fellow, grave and rather stately, but full of the cordial courtesy and respect we see so little of nowadays, and which is the sure sign of good home training. The cadets, as Will and Geordie called themselves, were there as gorgeous as you please, and the agonies they suffered that night with tight boots and stiff collars no pen can fitly tell. But only to one another did they confide these sufferings in the rare moments of repose when they could stand on one aching foot with heads comfortably sunken inside the excruciating collars which rasped their ears and made the lobes thereof a pleasing scarlet. Brief were these moments, however, and the Spartan boys danced on with smiling faces, undaunted by the hidden anguish which preyed upon them fore and aft, as Will expressed it. Mrs. Jane's pair were an odd contrast, and even the stern disciplinarian herself could not help smiling as she watched them. Steve was superb and might have been married on the spot, so superfine was his broadcloth, glossy as linen, and perfect the fit of his gloves, while pride and happiness so fermented in his youthful bosom that there would have been danger of spontaneous combustion if dancing had not proved a safety valve, for his strong sense of the proprieties would not permit him to vent his emotions in any other way. Kitty felt no such restraint, and looked like the blissful little gypsy, with her brunette prettiness set off by a dashing costume of cardinal and cream color, and every hair on her head curled in a merry Pecksniffian crop, for youth was her strong point, and she much enjoyed the fact that she had been engaged 3 times before she was 19. To see her and Steve spin round the room was a sight to bring a smile to the lips of the crustiest bachelors or saddest spinster, for happy lovers are always a pleasing spectacle, and 2 such merry little grigs as these are seldom seen. Mac, meantime, with glasses astride of his nose, surveyed his brother's performances on the light fantastic, very much as a benevolent Newfoundland would the gambols of a toy terrier, receiving with thanks the hasty hints for his guidance which Steve breathed into his ear as he passed, and forgetting all about them the next minute. When not thus engaged, Mac stood about with his thumbs in his vest pockets, regarding the lively crowd like a meditative philosopher of a cheerful aspect, often smiling to himself at some whimsical fancy of his own, knitting his brows as some bit of ill-natured gossip met his ear, or staring with undisguised admiration as a beautiful face or figure caught his eye. "I hope that girl knows what a treasure she has got, but I doubt if she ever fully appreciates it," said Mrs. Jane, bringing her spectacles to bear upon Kitty as she whisked by, causing quite a gale with her flying skirts. "I think she will, for Steve has been so well brought up she cannot but see and feel the worth of what she has never had, and being so young she will profit by it," answered Mrs. Jessie softly, thinking of the days when she and her Jem danced together, just betrothed. "I've done my duty by both the boys, and done it thoroughly, or their father would have spoilt them, for he's no more idea of discipline than a child," and Aunt Jane gave her own palm a smart rap with her closed fan, emphasizing the word thoroughly in a most suggestive manner. "I've often wished I had your firmness, Jane, but after all, I'm not sure that I don't like my own way best, at least with my boys, for plenty of love and plenty of patience seem to have succeeded pretty well." And Aunt Jessie lifted the nosegay from her lap, feeling as if that unfailing love and patience were already blooming into her life as beautifully as the sweet-breathed roses given by her boy refreshed and brightened these long hours of patient waiting in a corner. "I don't deny that you've done well, Jessie, but you've been left alone and had no one to hold your hand or interfere. If my Mac had gone to sea as your Jem did, I never should have been as severe as I am. Men are so perverse and short-sighted, they don't trouble about the future as long as things are quiet and comfortable in the present," continued Mrs. Jane, quite forgetting that the short-sighted partner of the firm, physically speaking at least, was herself. "Ah, yes, we mothers love to foresee and foretell our children's lives even before they are born, and are very apt to be disappointed if they do not turn out as we planned. I know I am, yet I really have no cause to complain, and am learning to see that all we can do is to give the dear boys good principles and the best training we may, then leave them to finish what we have begun." And Mrs. Jessie's eye wandered away to Archie, dancing with Rose, quite unconscious what a pretty little castle in the air tumbled down when he fell in love with Phoebe. "Right, quite right. On that point we agree exactly. I have spared nothing to give my boys good principles and good habits, and I am willing to trust them anywhere. 9 times did I whip my Steve to cure him of fibbing, and over again did Mac go without his dinner rather than wash his hands, but I whipped and starved them both into obedience, and now I have my reward," concluded the stern parent, with a proud wave of the fan, which looked very like a furl, being as big, hard, and uncompromising as such an article could be. Mrs. Jessie gave a mild murmur of assent, but could not help thinking with a smile that, in spite of their early tribulations, the sins for which the boys suffered had got a little mixed in their result, for fibbing Steve was now the tidy one, and careless Mac the truth-teller. But such small contradictions will happen in the best regulated families, and all perplexed parents can do is to keep up a steadfast preaching and practicing in the hope that it will bear fruit some time, for according to the old proverb, "Children pick up words as pigeons peas, to utter them again as God shall please." "I hope they won't dance the child to death among them, for each one seems bound to have his turn, even your sober Mac," said Mrs. Jessie a few minutes later, as she saw Archie hand Rose over to his cousin, who carried her off with an air of triumph from several other claimants. "She's very good to him, and her influence is excellent, for he's of an age now when a young woman's opinion has more weight than an old one's, though he is always good to his mother, and I feel as if I should take great comfort in him. He's one of the sort who will not marry till late, if ever, being fond of books and a quiet life," responded Mrs. Jane, remembering how often her son had expressed his belief that philosophers should not marry, and brought up Plato as an example of the serene wisdom only to be attained by a single man, while her husband sided with Socrates, for whom he felt a profound sympathy, though he didn't dare to own it. "Well, I don't know about that. Since my Archie surprised me by losing his heart as he did, I'm prepared for anything, and advise you to do likewise. I really shouldn't wonder if Mac did something remarkable in that line, though he shows no sign of it yet, I confess," answered Mrs. Jessie, laughing. "It won't be in that direction, you may be sure, for her fate is sealed. Dear me, how sad it is to see a superior girl like that about to throw herself away on a handsome scapegrace. I won't mention names, but you understand me," and Mrs. Jessie shook her head, as if she could mention the name of one superior girl who had thrown herself away and now saw the folly of it. "I'm very anxious, of course, and so is Alec, but it may be the saving of one party and the happiness of the other, for some women love to give more than they receive," said Mrs. Jessie, privately wondering for the thousandth time why Brother Mac ever married the learned Miss Humphreys. "You'll see that it won't prosper, and I shall always maintain that a wife cannot entirely undo a mother's work. Rose will have her hands full if she tries to set all Clara's mistakes right," answered Aunt Jane grimly, then began to fan violently as their hostess approached to have a dish of chat about "our dear young people." Rose was in a merry mood that night and found Mac quite ready for fun, which was fortunate since her first remark set them off on a droll subject. "Oh, Mac, Annabel has just confided to me that she is engaged to Fun C. Think of her going to housekeeping in Canton some day and having to order rats, puppies, and bird's nest soup for dinner," whispered Rose, too much amused to keep the news to herself. "By Confucius, isn't that a sweet prospect?" And Mac burst out laughing, to the great surprise of his neighbors, who wondered what there was amusing about the Chinese sage. "It is rather alarming, though, to have these infants going on at this rate. Seems to be catching a new sort of scarlet fever, to judge by Annabel's cheeks and Kitty's gown," he added, regarding the aforesaid ladies with eyes still twinkling with merriment. "Don't be ungallant, but go and do likewise, for it is all the fashion. I heard Mrs. Van tell old Mrs. Joy that it was sure to be a marrying year, so you'll be sure to catch it," answered Rose, reefing her skirts, for with all his training Mac still found it difficult to keep his long legs out of the man-traps. "It doesn't look like a painful disease, but I must be careful, for I have no time to be ill now. What are the symptoms?" asked Mac, trying to combine business with pleasure and improve his mind while doing his duty. "If you ever come back, I'll tell you," laughed Rose, as he danced away into the wrong corner, bumped smartly against another gentleman, and returned as soberly as if that was the proper figure. "Well, tell me how not to do it," he said, subsiding for a moment's talk, when Rose had floated to and fro in her turn. "Oh, you see some young girl who strikes you as particularly charming. Whether she really is or not doesn't matter a bit, and you begin to think about her a great deal, to want to see her, and to get generally sentimental and absurd," began Rose, finding it difficult to give a diagnosis of the most mysterious disease under the sun. "Don't think it sounds enticing. Can't I find an antidote somewhere? For if it is to be in the air this year, I'm sure to get it, and it may be fatal," said Mac, who felt pretty lively and liked to make Rose merry, for he suspected that she had a little trouble from a hint Dr. Alec had given him. "I hope you will catch it, because you'll be so funny." "Will you take care of me as you did before, or have you got your hands full?" "I'll help, but really with Archie and Steve and Charlie, I shall have enough to do. You'd better take it lightly the first time, and so won't need much care." "Very well, how shall I begin? Enlighten my ignorance and start me right, I beg." "Go about and see people, make yourself agreeable, and not sit in corners observing other people as if they were puppets dancing for your amusement. I heard Mrs. Van once say that propinquity works wonders, and she ought to know, having married off 2 daughters and just engaged a third to a most charming young man." "Good lack! The cure sounds worse than the disease. Propinquity, hey? Why, I may be in danger this identical moment, and can't flee from my life," said Mac, gently catching her round the waist for a general waltz. "Don't be alarmed, but mind your steps, for Charlie is looking at us, and I want you to do your best. That's perfect. Take me quite round, for I love to waltz and seldom get a good turn except with you boys," said Rose, smiling up at him approvingly as his strong arm guided her among the revolving couples and his feet kept time without a fault. "This certainly is a great improvement on the chair business, to which I have devoted myself with such energy that I've broken the backs of 2 partners and dislocated the arms of the old rocker. I took an occasional turn with that heavy party, thinking it good practice in case I ever happened to dance with stout ladies," and Mac nodded toward Annabel, pounding gaily away with Mr. Tokio, whose yellow countenance beamed as his beady eyes rested on his plump fiancée. Pausing in the midst of her merriment at the image of Mac in the old rocking chair, Rose said reprovingly, "Though a heathen Chinee, Fun puts you to shame, for he did not ask foolish questions, but went a-wooing like a sensible little man, and I've no doubt Annabel will be very happy." "Choose me a subtle divinity, and I will try to adore. Can I do more than that to retrieve my character?" answered Mac, safely landing his partner and plying the fan according to instructions. "How would Emma do?" inquired Rose, whose sense of the ludicrous was strong, and who could not resist the temptation of horrifying Mac by the suggestion. "Never! It sets my teeth on edge to look at her tonight. I suppose that dress is a sweet thing just out, but upon my word she reminds me of nothing but the harlequin ice," and Mac turned his back on her with a shudder, for he was sensitive to discords of all kinds. "She certainly does, and that mixture of chocolate, pea green, and pink is simply detestable, though many people would consider it decidedly chic, to use her favorite word. I suppose you will dress your wife like a Spartan matron of the time of Lycurgus," added Rose, much tickled by his new conceit. "I'll wait till I get her before I decide, but one thing I'm sure of, she shall not dress like a Greek dancer of the time of Pericles," answered Mac, regarding with great disfavor a young woman who, having a statuesque figure, affected drapery of the scanty and clinging description. "Then it is no use to suggest that classic creature, so, as you reject my first attempts, I won't go on, but look about me quietly, and you had better do the same. Seriously, Mac, more gaiety and less study would do you good, for you will grow old before your time if you shut yourself up and pore over books so much." "I don't believe there is a younger or a jollier feeling fellow in the room than I am, though I may not conduct myself like a dancing dervish. But I own you may be right about the books, for there are many sorts of intemperance, and a library is as irresistible to me as a barroom to a toper. I shall have to sign a pledge and cork up the only bottle that tempts me, my inkstand." "I'll tell you how to make it easier to abstain. Stop studying and write a novel into which you can put all your wise things, and so clear your brains for a new start by and by. Do! I should so like to read it," cried Rose, delighted with the project, for she was sure that Mac could do anything he liked in that line. "First live, then write. How can I go to romancing till I know what romance means?" he asked soberly, feeling that so far he had had very little in his life. "Then you must find out, and nothing will help you more than to love someone very much. Do as I've advised and be a modern Diogenes, going about with spectacles instead of a lantern, in search, not of an honest man, but a perfect woman. I do hope you will be successful." And Rose made her courtesy as the dance ended. "I don't expect perfection, but I should like one as good as they ever make them nowadays. If you are looking for an honest man, I wish you success in return," said Mac, relinquishing her fan with a glance of such sympathetic significance that a quick flush of feeling rose to the girl's face as she answered very low, "If honesty was all I wanted, I certainly have found it in you." Then she went away with Charlie, who was waiting for his turn, and Mac roamed about, wondering if anywhere in all that crowd his future wife was hiding, saying to himself, as he glanced from face to face, quite unresponsive to the various allurements displayed, "What care I how fair she be, if she be not fair for me?" Just before supper, several young ladies met in the dressing room to repair damages, and being friends, they fell into discourse as they smoothed their locks and had their tattered furbelows sewed or pinned up by the neat-handed Phyllis in waiting. When each had asked the other, "How do I look tonight, dear?" and been answered with reciprocal enthusiasm, "Perfectly lovely, darling," Kitty said to Rose, who was helping her to restore order out of the chaos to which much exercise had reduced her curls, "By the way, young Randall is dying to be presented to you. May I after supper?" "No, thank you," answered Rose very decidedly. "Well, I'm sure I don't see why not," began Kitty, looking displeased but not surprised. "I think you do. Else why didn't you present him when he asked? You seldom stop to think of etiquette. Why did you now?" "I didn't like to do it till I had You were so particular. I thought you'd say no, but I couldn't tell him so," stammered Kitty, feeling that she had better have settled the matter herself, for Rose was very particular and had a special reason to dislike this person, because he was not only a dissipated young reprobate himself, but seemed possessed of Satan to lead others astray likewise. "I don't wish to be rude, dear, but I really must decline, for I cannot know such people, even though I meet them here," said Rose, remembering Charlie's revelations on New Year's night, and hardening her heart against the man who had been his undoing on that as well as on other occasions, she had reason to believe. "I couldn't help it. Old Mr. Randall and Papa are friends, and, though I spoke of it, Brother Alf wouldn't hear of passing that bad boy over," explained Kitty eagerly. "Yet Alf forbade your driving or skating with him, for he knows better than we how unfit he is to come among us." "I'd drop him tomorrow if I could, but I must be civil in my own house. His mother brought him, and he won't dare to behave here as he does at their bachelor parties." "She ought not to have brought him till he had shown some desire to mend his ways. It is none of my business, I know, but I do wish people wouldn't be so inconsistent, letting boys go to destruction and then expecting us girls to receive them like decent people." Rose spoke in an energetic whisper, but Annabel heard her and exclaimed as she turned round with a powder puff in her hand, "My goodness, Rose, what is all that about going to destruction?" "She is being strong-minded, and I don't very much blame her in this case, but it leaves me in a dreadful scrape," said Kitty, supporting her spirits with a sniff of aromatic vinegar. "I appeal to you, since you've heard me, and there's no one here but ourselves. Do you consider young Randall a nice person to know?" And Rose turned to Annabel and Emma with an anxious eye, for she did not find it easy to abide by her own principles when so doing annoyed her friends. "No, indeed, he's perfectly horrid. Papa says he and Gorham are the wildest young men he knows, and enough to spoil the whole set. I'm so glad I've got no brothers," responded Annabel, placidly powdering her pink arms, quite undeterred by the memory of sundry white streaks left on sundry coat sleeves. "I think that sort of scrupulousness is very ill-bred, if you'll excuse me saying so, Rose. We are not supposed to know anything about fastness and wildness and so on, but to treat every man alike and not be fussy and prudish," said Emma, settling her many-colored streamers with the superior air of a woman of the world, aged 20. "Ah, but we do know, and if our silence and civility have no effect, we ought to try something else and not encourage wickedness of any kind. We needn't scold and preach, but we can refuse to know such people, and that will do some good, for they don't like to be shunned and shut out from respectable society. Uncle Alec told me not to know that man, and I won't." Rose spoke with unusual warmth, forgetting that she could not tell the real reason for her strong prejudice against "that man." "Well, I know him. I think him very jolly, and I'm engaged to dance the German with him after supper. He leads quite as well as your cousin Charlie, and is quite as fascinating, some people think," returned Emma, tossing her head disdainfully, for Prince Charming did not worship at her shrine, and it piqued her vanity. In spite of her quandary, Rose could not help smiling as she recalled Mac's comparison, for Emma turned so red with spiteful chagrin she seemed to have added strawberry ice to the other varieties composing the harlequin. "Each must judge for herself. I shall follow Aunt Jessie's advice and try to keep my atmosphere as pure as I can, for she says every woman has her own little circle, and in it can use her influence for good if she will. I will heartily, and I'll prove that I'm neither proud nor fussy by receiving, here or at home, any respectable man you like to present to me, no matter how poor or plain or insignificant he may be." With which declaration Rose ended her protest, and the four damsels streamed downstairs together like a wandering rainbow. But Kitty laid to heart what she had said, Annabel took credit to herself for siding with her, and Emma owned that she was not trying to keep her atmosphere pure when she came to dance with the objectionable Randall. So Rose's "little circle" was the better for the influence she tried to exert, although she never knew it. All supper time Charlie kept near her, and she was quite content with him, for he drank only coffee, and she saw him shake his head with a frown when young Van beckoned him toward an anteroom from whence the sound of popping corks had issued with increasing frequency as the evening wore on. "Dear fellow, he does try," thought Rose, longing to show him she admired his self-denial, but she could only say as they left the supper room with the aunts, who were going early, if I had not promised Uncle to get home as soon after midnight as possible, I'd stay and dance the German with you, for you deserve a reward tonight." "1,000 thanks, but I am going when you do," answered Charlie, understanding both her look and words, and very grateful for them. "Really?" cried Rose, delighted. "Really. I'll be in the hall when you come down." And Charlie thought the Fra Angelico angel was not half so bright and beautiful as the one who looked back at him out of the pale blue cloud as Rose went upstairs as if on wings. When she came down again, Charlie was not in the hall, however, and after waiting a few minutes, Mac offered to go and find him, for Aunt Jane was still hunting a lost rubber bub. "Please say I'm ready, but he needn't come if he doesn't want to," said Rose, not wishing to demand too much of her promising penitent. "If he has gone into that barroom, I'll have him out no matter who is there," growled Mac to himself as he made his way to the small apartment whither the gentleman retired for a little private refreshment when the spirit moved, as it often did. The door was ajar, and Charlie seemed to have just entered, for Mac heard a familiar voice call out in a jovial tone, "Come, Prince, you're just in time to help us drink Steve's health with all the honors." "Can't stop, only ran in to say good night, Van. Had a capital time, but I'm on duty and must go." "That's a new dodge. Take a stirrup cup, anyway, and come back in time for a merry-go-rounder when you've disposed of the ladies," answered the young host, diving into the wine cooler for another bottle. "Charlie's going in for sanctity, and it doesn't seem to agree with him," laughed one of the two other young men, who occupied several chairs apiece, resting their soles in every sense of the word. "Apron strings are coming into fashion. The bluer the better, hey, Prince?" added the other, trying to be witty with the usual success. "You'd better go home early yourself, Beryl, or that tongue of yours will get you into trouble," retorted Charlie, conscious that he ought to take his own advice, yet lingering, nervously putting on his gloves while the glasses were being filled. "Now, brother-in-law, fire away. Here you are, Prince." And Steve handed a glass across the table to his cousin, feeling too much elated with various pleasurable emotions to think what he was doing, for the boys all knew Charlie's weakness and usually tried to defend him from it. Before the glass could be taken, however, Mac entered in a great hurry, delivering his message in an abbreviated and rather peremptory form. "Rose is waiting for you. Hurry up." "All right. Good night, old fellows." And Charlie was off, as if the name had power to stop him in the very act of breaking the promise made to himself. "Come, Salone, take a social drop and give us an epithalamium in your best Greek. Here's to you." And Steve was lifting the wine to his own lips when Mac knocked the glass out of his hand with a flash of the eye that caused his brother to stare at him with his mouth open in an imbecile sort of way, which seemed to excite Mac still more, for, turning to his young host, he said in a low voice and with a look that made the gentleman on the chair sit up suddenly, "I beg pardon, Van, for making a mess, but I can't stand by and see my own brother tempt another man beyond his strength or make a brute of himself. That's plain English, but I can't help speaking out, for I know not one of you would willingly hurt Charlie, and you will if you don't let him alone." "What do you pitch into me for? I've done nothing. A fellow must be civil in his own house, mustn't he?" asked Van good-humoredly as he faced about, corkscrew in hand. "Yes, but it is not civil to urge or joke a guest into doing what you know and he knows is bad for him. That's only a glass of wine to you, but it is perdition to Charlie, and, if Steve knew what he was about, he'd cut his right hand off before he'd offer it." "Do you mean to say I'm tipsy?" demanded Steve, ruffling up like a little gamecock, for, though he saw now what he had done and was ashamed of it, he hated to have Mac air his peculiar notions before other people. "With excitement, not champagne, I hope, for I wouldn't own you if you were," answered Mac, in whom indignation was effervescing like the wine in the forgotten bottle, for the men were all young friends of Steve's and admirers of Charlie. "Look here, boys," he went on more quietly, "I know I ought not to explode in this violent sort of way, but upon my life I couldn't help it when I heard what you were saying and saw what Steve was doing. Since I have begun, I may as well finish and tell you straight out that Prince can't stand this sort of thing. He is trying to flee temptation, and whosoever leads him into it does a cowardly and sinful act, for the loss of one's own self-respect is bad enough, without losing the more precious things that make life worth having. Don't tell him I've said this, but lend a hand if you can, and never have to reproach yourselves with the knowledge that you helped to ruin a fellow creature, soul and body." It was well for the success of Mac's first crusade that his hearers were gentlemen and sober, so his outburst was not received with jeers or laughter, but listened to in silence, while the expression of the faces changed from one of surprise to regret and respect, for earnestness is always effective, and championship of this sort seldom fails to touch hearts as yet unspoiled. As he paused with an eloquent little quiver in his eager voice, Van corked the bottle at a blow, threw down the corkscrew, and offered Mac his hand, saying heartily, in spite of his slang, "You're a first-class old brick. I'll lend a hand for one, and do my best to back up Charlie, for he's the finest fellow I know, and shan't go to the devil like poor Randall if I can help it." Murmurs of applause from the others seemed to express a general assent to this vigorous statement, and giving the hand a grateful shake, Mac retreated to the door, anxious to be off now that he had freed his mind with such unusual impetuosity. "Count on me for anything I can do in return for this, Van. I'm sorry to be such a marplot, but you can take it out in quizzing me after I'm gone. I'm fair game, and Steve can set you going." With that, Mac departed as abruptly as he came, feeling that he had made a mess of it, but comforting himself with the thought that perhaps he had secured help for Charlie at his own expense, and thinking with a droll smile as he went back to his mother, "My romance begins by looking after other girls' lovers instead of finding a sweetheart for myself. But I can't tell Rose, so she won't laugh at me." End of Chapter 12. Recording by Maria Therese.